they're federal cops, but they're still cops, and nothing kind of illustrated that more than the incredible investigative work that you do into what happened here in Denver. So let's just start there. You focus on one particular FBI informant named Mickey Windecker. How did you kind of zero in on this story? I mean, of course not giving up any sources or anything like that, but how did you come to this vaguely? And if you, for the audience, if you don't mind, just telling a little bit about the initial contours of this story.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, when the summer of 2020 happened, it was my theory that the FBI would use these same type of sting tactics that had been refined during the war on terror against these demonstrators. And I'd spent a good amount of time trying to find an example of this and came up empty. And then finally, about a year ago, I was able to get access to about 300 pages of internal FBI reports and about a dozen hours of recordings from the FBI informant. And what it showed was that in the summer of 2020, this informant named Michael Windecker, he went by Mickey Windecker, a violent felon with a long history of deception, had gone to the local police. And in every major metro area, there's something called a joint terrorism task force, which is a partnership between the FBI and local police. He goes to the local police, says he has information about protesters. They then refer him to the FBI, and he tells them, I know these people, I go to the protests, and they are using incendiary rhetoric. They're saying, we want to burn the city down, stuff that, certainly is protected by First Amendment rights, is questionable, but also stuff that was like all over the news in Denver, right? So this wasn't like he was providing very secret squirrel information, right? This was just stuff that you could have picked up watching the news. And yet the FBI hired him as an informant and paid him tens of thousands of dollars to infiltrate the movement. And what's so striking about him is kind of that he has a cartoonish quality. This was a guy who was pushing 50. He had tattoos all over his body. He drove a silver hearse and he put a bunch of guns in the back and he just rode up into the demonstrations. And what he did that was quite sophisticated, if not maybe accidental even, was that this was a guy who was naturally suspicious. He was much older than most of the demonstrators. He was a white guy with tattoos that looked like a biker, not someone you'd necessarily picture as a racial justice activist. But he allied himself very quickly with some young activists who were impressionable and a bit naive. And I think that ended up disarming a lot of the other protesters who thought, okay, well, if these young activists are with him, he must be okay. And what he did once he got inside the activist groups was that he started, just like the FBI did in the 1960s, started accusing the real leaders of these activist groups of being FBI informants, or so-called snitch jacketing. And then when he sowed enough confusion, he ended up creating a leadership vacuum that he then filled, and then was able to encourage some of these demonstrations to become violent, and also specifically tried to set up some activists in crimes.
And he was successful in one. I mean, I want to talk a bit about the profile of Windecker, because honestly, it fits a lot of what you see wannabe cops who end up committing kind of like acts of violence on themselves, committing acts of violence themselves, obsessed with authority, that kind of profile. It's a through line with right-wing figures and kind of like even the Proud Boys or Oath Keeper types, for example. But he specifically like set up a guy named Zeb to end up buying a gun for him, which they ended up actually like arresting this particular individual, and he successfully was able to entrap him, essentially. Tell that story if you don't mind.
Yeah, so it's important to understand that Mickey portrayed himself almost as like a mercenary. He claimed to have fought with the French Foreign Legion. He spent some time with the Kurdish forces in Iraq, the Peshmerga. He had pictures of dead ISIS soldiers on his phone. So he'd show these pictures of dead ISIS fighters with him standing over them. And he gave off this impression that he was a very, very violent dude. And in fact, he was one. But what he made part of his identity as an FBI informant, as an undercover activist, was this kind of looming sense of violence, that if you betrayed him in any way, something might happen to you. And that was in some ways how he was able to get activists to do things that they might not perhaps otherwise have done, because they were just scared of Mickey. And so one of the first attempts that Mickey did was to try to stitch together a very, very elaborate plot, something in line with what you saw with the Michigan Whitmer plot, which was that Mickey took two activists and tried to encourage them to engage in an assassination plot against Colorado's attorney general. Ultimately, both men were like, no, I don't want anything to do with this, and backed out. And so then the FBI is left with a situation where they don't have any criminal case to pull. And so what they do is they take one of the activists, Zeb Hall, and they have Mickey give him money and ask him to buy him a gun. And what was particularly problematic about what they did was that Mickey had a hearse full of guns. All the activists described how he had this silver hearse and there were guns in the back. There's a video you can still watch on YouTube of him standing in front of a gun. And so he claimed to be a felon, but he had lots of guns. As Zeb says that he was confused about the legality of what Mickey was able to own. And at the same time, he was just scared of Mickey. So when Mickey gives him the money to buy the gun, he admits now it was a mistake, but says he wouldn't have done it were it not for Mickey kind of, scaring him, giving the money, kind of pushing him toward doing that. And so then ultimately he gets $1,500 from Mickey, buys a gun, and then gives it to Mickey. The irony being in this that he used FBI money to buy a gun that's given to an FBI informant who then gives it to the FBI, right? So that no one was harmed in this crime. It was manufactured from start to finish by the FBI. And then roughly a year after the racial justice demonstrations in July 2021, he's ultimately arrested at his workplace by several FBI agents and charged with transferring a gun to a felon. And for Zeb, it's a situation where he could take it to trial. He could argue entrapment. But the federal guidelines are such that it's really intimidating for a person like him with a public defender. If he took it to trial and he loses, he faces up to 10 years in prison. Whereas the prosecutors say, well, just plead guilty and you can take 3 years of probation. So that's what he does. And so ultimately, the crime that Mickey Windecker, the FBI informant, is able to get these racial justice demonstrators to commit is relatively minor. This instance where Zeb Hall purchased a gun for the FBI informant. But what they tried to do was stitch together this plot where they could have announced to the public, look at all these racial justice demonstrators participating in this plot to assassinate the attorney general. I told you they were violent. And what I mean by that is it's important to understand that in the context of this case of the summer of 2020, the Trump administration at the time was really trumpeting this idea that Black Lives Matter activists, racial justice activists, so-called Antifa activists were dangerous. And this was being echoed by right-wing media at the time. And so if you have a plot to assassinate the attorney general, it fits perfectly into that narrative. But ultimately, they were unsuccessful in pulling it off.
They didn't do it.
Their goal. They didn't do it, yeah.
He was unable, despite all of his guns and all of his incendiary rhetoric, and he was aggressive in it, based on the incredible recordings you have. I mean, you have so much raw material in this podcast that people 100% should check out because you hear it from the horse's mouth, honestly. And body cam footage and the audio that comes from that as well. He was really pushing activists to commit acts of violence, and they didn't end up doing it. And it's almost like the Denver FBI field office wanted to cover their ass because they were unable to actually encourage acts of violence and trick people into doing that through Mickey. And so they had to get one arrest, and a year later they come back and arrest Zeb, who, it should be noted, is also a black man. Right.
And it's important to note too, I mean, I'm not ascribing any motives on this, but just pointing out the facts that, obviously there were Black, white, Latino, Asian demonstrators. The men he specifically targeted were Black men in the racial justice movement, Zeb Hall and another man named Bryce Shelby. It's also important to recognize too, I think, that Mickey was trying to get them to move forward in this plot, was unable to do that, but then at the same time was encouraging the demonstrations themselves to become more and more violent. And so when some of the greatest violence that occurred in Denver were demonstrations that Mickey had encouraged. There was hyping up, was getting people to come out saying you should bring guns, saying you should get more violent. And during the last week of August, when there was a spate of protests that turned violent, I think 70 some Denver police officers were injured. Protesters had bones broken, had serious injuries. The city and county of Denver have to pay $14 million in damages as a result of that demonstration. What you're seeing is that Mickey at the time was in a leadership role and was pushing people to become more and more violent. And so I think there's two things that are particularly troubling about what happened in Denver. One was that Mickey specifically was snitch jacketing Black leaders in the racial justice movement and was trying to set up Black activists in crimes. And then on a more broad level, was encouraging these incidents to become, these protests to become more and more violent. And so we can't pinpoint, we can't cast all the blame on Mickey for these demonstrations that turned violent. But what we know is that he was in a leadership role when this happened. And I think it's particularly troubling that we even have to ask the question, what role did the government's undercover informant play in pushing these protests to become more and more violent?
And I mean, the further violence would justify further crackdowns and further law enforcement kind of going into some of these protests. It's almost as if like that is part of the reasoning, the provocation, right? And we also don't know, and I'm sure you're going to be doing some work on this front. How many other cities this happened in? How many other informants were stoking activists and trying hard to get them to commit acts of violence, as you have Fox News talking about rioting and looting and rioting and looting, and the president doing so at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, this was an important narrative for right-wing media, right? This idea that these protests aren't just peaceful protests for people speaking out for better rights and police accountability. These are violent protests, and these are domestic extremists. That's how they wanted it painted, even though the vast majority of these were peaceful demonstrations. And my hope is in revealing what happened in Denver, that maybe we can find out more about similar cases that happened elsewhere in the country, because I think it's unreasonable to think that this is somehow anomalous, that this only happened in Denver, that it was just a few bad actors. I think it's more likely that this was part of a larger strategy that played out across the country in other cities. Throughout that summer, activists reported all sorts of strange behavior from strangers coming into the groups advocating violence. Among the most commonly cited ones is the so-called umbrella man in Minneapolis, who was seen
Right.
crashing windows. We don't know what his relationship to any of this is, but there are enough strange things that happen in these cities. People that other activists felt were highly suspicious, potentially infiltrators of some sort, that they were concerned that the FBI may have done this. And so what the Denver case shows is that those people might not be crazy, right? Like it happened in Denver. It doesn't mean it necessarily happened in all of those instances, but since it happened in Denver, I think it's reasonable to question where else it happened. And my hope is that we can reveal some of that in the future.
Can you talk about Mickey in particular, Mickey Windecker, and who he was? If you mentioned how he did spend some time kind of cosplaying being a soldier abroad, right, volunteering and posing with dead bodies, and it seemed like the bodies were there for a long time before he posed next to them. Also, domestic violence record. You have an amazing interview with his ex-wife, who details how incredibly violent he was as well. Just tell us a bit about him and how he got to this place, because as I said before, I think that law enforcement targets these types, the guys that kind of want to be cops or have a sense of authority and are drawn to violence, and he certainly fit that profile.
Yeah, so Mickey was a guy who, had made violence a part of his identity. As I mentioned, he claimed to have fought for the French Foreign Legion. There's questions about that. He did spend some time with the Peshmerga in Iraq, and as you mentioned, one of the things that he would do is post pictures to Facebook and have pictures on his phone of dead bodies and himself standing over them. What's highly suspicious about them, and I talked to several Peshmerga volunteers who fought with him, is that, oftentimes these pictures were of bodies that were quite deteriorated. So he was often coming to the battlefield late, taking pictures, and then making himself out to be a war hero. The FBI knew about this history when it hired him. It also knew about his larger criminal history. Mickey, when he was 20, had sex with a 14-year-old and was charged with sexual assault. He claimed he didn't know the girl was underage, ended up pleading that down to a misdemeanor sexual assault. Later, he was convicted of felony menacing when he stuck a gun in a woman's face and said he was a police officer looking for a suspect. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, and that's the earliest that we have record of him becoming an informant. While in prison, he was approached to commit a murder for hire, and instead of committing the murder, he becomes an informant and then gets out, and there there appears to be a record, or there is a record of him cooperating and providing information to police after that, between the time of his being released from prison and his employment by the FBI. And so what I think happened, which is not uncommon among informants, is that informants begin to realize that you can make a living being an informant. This can be your career. And so you provide information to cops, you put yourself in a position where you can gin up crimes and provide information. And that became Mickey's role for a good amount of time. At the same time, as you mentioned, he had abusive relationships. He allegedly assaulted his ex-wife, which we describe in the show, through her interview, as well as body cam footage that we received of police responding to the incident. But I think it's important to realize that the context of Mickey going to the FBI isn't someone who is, Mr. Captain America wanting to save the country, sees violence happening and reports it to the police. This was a man who had learned that you can make a lot of money providing information to the police. And so when the protests break out in the summer of 2020, my theory is that Mickey saw it as a payday. He knew that if he could get in there,
he's a professional snitch.
He's a professional snitch, exactly. And he knew that this was a big case for the FBI. He knew if he could insert himself into there, he would make a lot of money, and he did. We do have records, payment receipt records of Mickey being paid a little more than $20,000 that summer. But we also know that he was employed by the FBI through it for at least a year, through Zeb's arrest in July 2021. So it's our belief that our payment records we have are incomplete, that it's just a portion of what he was paid during that time. And it's true that informants can make in excess of 6 figures a year. And so Mickey likely realized that by providing information to the FBI about these racial justice demonstrators, he could make a lot of money. And I think it's important to understand the perverse incentive that paid informants have, which is that you only get paid by the FBI if you bring cases. So Mickey couldn't go into the racial justice movement and say, hey, I asked around and I was there and no one's committing any crimes, right? He has a direct financial incentive to push people into crimes. And that's what he did. And that's what informants often do. And this is part of the corrupt nature of the FBI informant program, is that there really aren't any controls in place to make sure that informants incentivized by money aren't pushing defendants or targets of investigations along just so that they can get paid.
Well, it's like a quota system, and to a degree, right? I mean, cops have that too. Like they'll get paid a little bit extra sometimes if they get enough tickets and things like that.
No, and I would say like it's that structure works for the agents too, right? The agent Scott Dahlstrom handling Mickey probably knew that maybe he could get a promotion if he proved this big case involving, a plot to assassinate the attorney general, right? There's incentives throughout the line that aren't necessarily in the interest of justice, but are just in the interest of bureaucracy.
Well, and I think that speaks as a larger systemic problem with the FBI itself, right? And why, I mean, I know you plan on continuing this podcast, right? Like as you, the hope is that this story will get more traction, and maybe there will be more things that come to light and people can come to you if they have any information about, say, more of these kinds of FBI informants in activist groups and Black Lives Matter protests, among others, right?
Yeah, so Alphabet Boys is a multi-season show. So the first season is about this case in Denver with Mickey infiltrating the Black Lives Matter movement there. Our second season is about a totally different case. But our hope is that we can tell stories in depth each season, one story told over 10 episodes, where we can look at malfeasance and corruption by federal law enforcement and really ask the question that underlies a lot of these cases, which is, are the FBI creating the bad guys or are they catching them? And you can argue in the case in Denver that they were very much creating them. And so that's really what we want to look at, is kind of the problematic cases that many of these federal law enforcement agencies are pursuing.
Last question before I let you go. How much of this is the Denver field office? How much of it is specific to like field offices making determinations and maybe being more rotten than the other, or more eager than the other? Because of course these protests happen in almost every major city in America. So I'm just curious about if you have any information about where, like, does this come from the top? Is it the rogue field office, or is it? Well, I know it's not a rogue field office. That's bad phrasing. I just mean, like, did it go any higher based on the information that you have?
Yeah, so I mean, there are offices that are sometimes more problematic than others. The Las Vegas office of the FBI has a long history of having problematic cases. For example, Denver is not one that has that history. But what we do explore in Alphabet Boys is that the investigation in Denver ended up sparking a separate investigation 90 miles south in Colorado Springs, where they used an undercover cop as the infiltrator. And so what that means, I believe, is that it shows that this wasn't anomalous, right? That it wasn't just Denver and some bad apples there who were getting involved in this. That since it also happened in Colorado Springs, it shows that this was part of a larger strategy that was at least somewhat accepted. And my theory, and we don't have any documents that have a deputy director or anyone signing off on these things, but what we do know is that there are a number of safeguards in place in FBI policy when they are investigating First Amendment protected activities. They do need sign off from headquarters. And so my assumption would be, given that this was First Amendment protected activity, that they were looking at protesters, there would have been some oversight and some sign off in Washington. That's speculative, but I think that's more likely than not. But the larger point I would make is that I don't think it's reasonable to think that this is just a one-off, that this only happened in Denver. I think, Mickey Windecker, the informant there, was particularly egregious for a number of reasons. But I suspect that similar cases happened around the country, places like Portland, Minneapolis, Chicago, New York, other places where there was a lot of activity during the summer of 2020.
Well, Trevor Aaronson, the podcast is Alphabet Boys. The first 4 episodes are up as we record this. They're gripping, and I couldn't recommend it more highly. It's in partnership with Western Sound and iHeart Podcasts, and you can also read some of his work at The Intercept. Trevor, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course.